Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that you really can't disentangle from the history of medical cannabis cultivation and historical use, as well as the future of medical cannabis research. And that topic is the prohibition of medical cannabis and the consequences of such for our ancestors, for us currently, and for our future generations. Now, perhaps the best starting point is to look back at other instances of prohibition in American history. And obviously, the most recent and probably one of the most relevant is the Prohibition Act of 1919. According to the National Prohibition Act, any beverage that contained more than 0.5% alcohol by volume was essentially prohibited from being manufactured and sold in the United States. Now, what this accomplished was a dramatic reduction in the consumption of beer in particular. However, there were many unintended consequences of this National Prohibition Act. And one of them actually was an increase in the manufacturing and the illicit sales of harder liquor. So, it makes sense in that basically people that are making a living off of selling alcohol are going to be more profitable if they simply concentrate the potency of what they're selling. Obviously, this would lend itself to greater efficiency in being able to not only manufacture but distribute, in this case, the product of their trade. In addition to an increase in the manufacturing of harder and harder liquor, there were also the consequences of those individuals that consumed this hard liquor that oftentimes was poisoned. So, you have a lot of folks that may not have been professionally skilled in this trade, essentially tinkering with different types of concoctions and technology. And certainly there's many documented deaths as a result of individuals perhaps drinking tainted moonshine. In addition to an increase in the consumption of harder liquor and all the medical health problems that result from such, the National Prohibition Act of 1919 also resulted in an increase in a whole host of substance-related deaths, as well as an increase in governmental spending to essentially handle the caseloads, an increase in prison populations, and there was also an increase in other forms of violent criminality. So essentially this act caused many tremendous problems in our society. Part of these problems arose because essentially the alcohol industry became decentralized and essentially placed in the hands of folks that were engaging in illicit behaviors. So essentially we had an entirely unregulated market. And this also resulted in the increase in the consumption of the hardest forms of liquor. And as we all know, alcohol in and of itself is a tremendous risk factor for so many different types of societal problems that unfortunately oftentimes carry over intergenerationally. Now, once the general population finally realized all the ills that the National Prohibition Act was actually resulting in, they essentially repealed it through the 21st Amendment in 1933. So what this act did is essentially place all the different tiers of the alcohol industry, that is the producers, the wholesalers, and the retailers, this three-tiered system, into essentially a regulatory policy that was controlled at the state level. And within a few years, the consumption of alcohol actually fell 50%. But that wasn't the only time that we prohibited substance use as a society in the United States. So, for example, in 1875, San Francisco passed the Anti-Opium Ordinance. However, the big hit, at least for cannabis prohibition, really started to take its hold around 1936, when essentially a number of different industries and prominent individuals within our government promoted this reefer madness social, perhaps conditioning or engineering campaign. So the basic idea was to deter cannabis use, and they did so by essentially producing mass amounts of media that were quite dramatic and hysterical with regard to the potential effects of using cannabis. And during that time was the real stake in the heart for cannabis users, and that was the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. What this act actually did was create punitive consequences for violating the act, which mandated that the manufacturing and sale of cannabis require heavy taxes that were largely unattainable for the average farmer in the United States. So get this, the tax was actually $1 per ounce back in 1937, and this applied to anybody that was utilizing cannabis in their trade. So physicians, veterinarians, therapists, patients, and everybody else that was just simply using hemp, even for industrial purposes. Now again, cannabis was still allowed for industrial and medical purposes, but this tax was so expensive, it essentially made the cannabis industry die almost instantaneously. Now, you'll find many different types of documentaries on the prohibition of cannabis in the United States, and there are certainly some notorious historical figures that have seemed to have driven these prohibition policies. For example, perhaps foremost was Harry Anslinger. He was the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Now, Harry was well known for having a vitriol for cannabis usage, but unfortunately he was also well known for being bigoted towards ethnic minorities. And unfortunately, historically, there seems to be a coupling between perhaps the motivation to engage in social engineering that was discriminatory towards certain groups of Americans, and essentially an effective media and governmental campaign to prohibit the use of cannabis, and not only prohibit its use, but really to enact mass ability to control how people think about cannabis. So essentially there was a very effective mental conditioning over the stigmatization of cannabis in and of itself. So for example, Harry has been quoted as saying, "There are 100,000 total marijuana users in the United States, and most are Negroes, Hispanics, Filipinos, and entertainers. Their satanic music, jazz, and swing result from marijuana usage. This marijuana even causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others." Now, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 was later found to be unconstitutional in 1969. However, at that time, the second major hammer was about to drop for cannabis users. And that hammer was the passing of the Food and Drug Administration's Controlled Substances Act in 1970. What this act did was classify different narcotics according to their presumed danger and their medical relevance. So we have a 5-tiered system, and cannabis was classified as a Scheduled 1 drug, which essentially is the category designated for the most dangerous drugs in our society and those which have been deemed to have no observable medicinal value. So essentially we have the placing of cannabis in the most dangerous category, along with substances like heroin, ecstasy, and other types of psychedelics. Now, it is important to note that this is the hardest category for medical providers and scientists to be able to attain the certification to be able to administer cannabis for practical and scientific purposes. Since the passing of the Controlled Substances Act, cannabis has been largely off limits, not only for practical medicinal usage, but also for the ability of medical providers and scientists to be able to study the effects of the plant. Over the years, there have been many groups that have fought against cannabis's prohibition with different relative degrees of success. But unfortunately, cannabis prohibition and the criminal consequences that they entail have essentially victimized hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans throughout the years. Currently, out of the millions of people that are arrested for substance-related offenses, nearly half of them involve cannabis. This problem didn't arise out of nowhere. It is largely the result of what we've been calling the quote war on drugs, which was officially declared in the 1980s. And essentially this created a paradigmatic shift in how drug-related offenses were treated criminally. And there was a stronger legal shift in priorities towards more punitive objectives. So the war on drugs actually resulted in many different changes in how we treat criminal offenses for drug-related crimes. It created what they call mandatory minimums and has essentially resulted in skyrocketing prison population rates that are unfortunately disproportionately affecting ethnic minorities and particularly African Americans in the United States. So for example, having possession of 5 grams of crack mandated that the offender spend 5 years incarcerated. The war on drugs also made the federal forfeiture of assets of individuals that were accused of drug-related crimes a commonplace. But it also created a life of its own and, in essence, entire industries that were built around the prohibition, mainly of cannabis. So if you think about it, we have a situation where we have a few drug-related offenses and law enforcement officers essentially proclaiming the concern and seriousness of drug-related offenses, which can then be used to justify the aggrandizement, the enlargement of the law enforcement agencies that are specialized for targeting those drug-related offenses. Now obviously, if you have an increase in the personnel and the priorities to focus on drug-related offenses, you're going to result in more drug-related arrests, which can then be used to justify the aggrandizement and enlargement of drug enforcement agencies and so forth. So essentially we have a circular pattern whereby the prioritization is essentially used to justify the aggrandizement of the agency that essentially and inevitably results in the greater ability to justify its not only existence but further continuation and growth because of the increased number of arrests that it will naturally result in. Now, of course, there are other documentaries out there that talk about institutionalized corruption, even occurring within our federal government. So, for example, across some of these 3-lettered agencies. But that is a topic for another study. So what this has resulted in is, unfortunately, an expansion of our prison population such that the United States actually houses the greatest number of prisoners all over the world. And the majority of these prisoners have been arrested for drug-related offenses. And again, we cannot escape the fact that these offenses have disproportionately affected different sectors within our American societies. So currently, approximately 1/4 of young African American males are either currently incarcerated or on parole. And the majority of these individuals, again, were arrested for non-violent drug-related crimes. Now, it is important to note that the federal government has been assisted with the historical prohibition of cannabis by the private industry, and particularly several leading industries that have been driving cannabis prohibition lobbying for many years now. One of them, again, is the private prison industry, or we could call big law enforcement. So essentially a private prison, just like any other business, requires sales to exist. And in this case, we're talking about the number of individuals that are incarcerated under their services. Another major lobbyist for cannabis prohibition is big alcohol. This industry actually brings in over $200 billion a year and potentially sees cannabis as a direct threat to those sales. However, the largest player currently lobbying against the legalization of cannabis, can you guess it? It's Big Pharma. This is an industry that is shaking in its boots at the possibility that cannabis may be viewed favorably by medical patients. In fact, I've often said that I personally believe that cannabis is an existential threat to the current conventional pharmaceutical industry. And that is just simply based on my own observations and my data, basically showing that patients will oftentimes substitute many different classes of conventional pharmaceutical medications in favor of using cannabis once they are given the legal opportunity to do so. So just to put this in perspective, in 2015, the top 7 analgesic manufacturers reported a gross revenue of over $1 trillion. That's just 7 companies. So you can obviously see how not only powerful these industries are, but how much they have to lose with more and more individuals favoring cannabis over the products that they've been selling. So how have drug-related offenses changed most recently? Well, they were actually falling from about 2006 to 2015. Unfortunately, they have begun to skyrocket again since that point. And this is despite state-specific and widespread national polling that suggests that the vast majority of American citizens are actually in favor of cannabis legalization. And still, in 2018, nearly 4 in 10 drug-related arrests had something to do with either the manufacturing or the sale or the possession of cannabis. And that brings us to another major distinction in how cannabis has been treated federally and criminally, for example, even in contrast to other types of substances. So unlike heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine, and even fentanyl, the majority of cannabis-related arrests actually occur between ports of entry in the United States. So while those other types of drugs are usually targeted at points of entry, and those arrested typically will be high-level traffickers, the majority of the individuals that are arrested for cannabis-related offenses tend to be those single individuals that are simply busted for possession. And of course, cannabis prohibition laws are currently being lifted all over the country. So these statistics are bound to change. And at least personally, I think it's a great thing.